Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin this morning with Lincoln Schertz. He is with Lincoln Hill Partners, here to discuss the big alcohol bill recently signed into law. Lincoln, welcome back to the show. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks, Glenn. Happy to be here.
A huge bill. I mean, it's nothing new. We always see this really big omnibus type bill addressing alcohol laws every year. But talk about the need. This thing is more than 3,300 lines long. Yes, 3,300 is what I said. Why the need for that here in the state of Utah?
Well, and I think in Utah, keep in mind we are a control state here in the state of Utah, and with that means we're controlling the sale of alcohol from really inception all the way through the purchase of the alcohol. So when you've got the DABS who's essentially taking in all of those orders, pushing those out to all the restaurants, bars, as well as folks who go and visit the liquor stores, there's a lot of going on in that kind of business model. And so every year there are small tweaks as Utah continues to change and the demographics in Utah continue to change. We're also looking at ways in which we can kind of accommodate what I would call the new need for alcohol regulation here in the state.
You talk about a lot going into that process, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes when it comes to crafting a bill like this as well. Give us some inside baseball as much as you can as far as what is going on behind the scenes when you're looking at putting together a bill that, again, is more than 3,000 lines long.
Well, you got to appreciate there are a lot of stakeholders involved in this process. DABS historically has set up a task force that works on these issues through the interim. So during the summer and spring months, we'll be working on issues. We've already got a list of, I think, 20 issues for next year where we're always just kind of, I don't want to say chipping away, but working on policy considerations that the legislature will take up. That task force is headed by two members of the legislature that they call the alcohol policy lead. So historically, Senator Jerry Stevenson has always been very involved in these issues. He kind of heads that effort up in addition to Jeff Burton, Representative Burton on the House side as well.
Let's dig into what some of the most significant changes are this year. And you have to start looking at the top with an increase to the number of licenses. Talk about exactly what's happening there and the impact and significance of that.
Yeah, and the viewers may not appreciate this, but anytime a bar or a restaurant establishment seeks to sell alcohol, they have to go get a liquor license. And there are different categories of liquor licenses, some for bars, some for restaurants. In that process, DABS was running out of licenses. So I believe there were 17 applications in the January meeting. They had 2 licenses to give out. And again, that's in part change to the demographics in Utah as more and more people are coming in who may not be of the predominant faith that don't drink. Obviously, there's a lot more demand for those licenses. So what we did this year was increase the number of restaurant and bar licenses and what I'd call kind of a stopgap measure. So they added about 20 additional licenses to the queue, allowing for individuals to go and seek those licenses. But more importantly, they really created a process that we'll be working on this interim to relook at the way in which we allocate licenses here in the state.
Yeah, let's talk about that more in just a second. But first, when we talk about this additional 20, what kind of an impact does that have? Does that still leave a big backlog of those that would like to get their hands on one?
In working with the ABS, they think that will get them through the interim period until next legislative session. And the intent in the next legislative session is to kind of retool the whole process. And the hope is this will get us through that intervening period.
Okay, let's talk about what you just mentioned, and that's setting up a process of, or a task force, I should say, of looking into potentially the way we are divvying out these licenses. What is going to happen with that study?
So right now in the state of Utah, we allocate licenses based on a pro rata share of the population. So it's about 10,100 people. We get 1 license in the state. And as population grows, obviously more licenses come available. What's going to change now with the demographic changes, I think they're going to go look at more factors than just raw population numbers to see how many folks are actually drinking here in the state versus just how many people are in the state, and a host of other things. So the state will be consulting or hiring a private consultant to go out, do that analysis, see what the demand is. And as I mentioned, there's always stakeholders in this process. So there will be pressure to not give as many. And then obviously from industry, there will be folks who are wanting to seek additional and more licenses.
And what will the time frame be on that study?
Well, the goal is to have something prepared for the legislature to take up in the 2024 session. So we'd be looking January to March of next year when we'd run an additional piece of legislation. Those licenses would then become available next spring.
Okay. Drink portability was another issue addressed in this bill. Talk about what that is and the changes that were made.
Yeah, so in the state of Utah, in a restaurant setting, so in a bar setting, you can walk around with your beverage. But in a restaurant setting, you have to be seated at a table in order to be served a drink. The dilemma is sometimes, as you know, you go to restaurants and as you're waiting for a table, you may go up to the bar, grab a drink. You physically cannot take that drink to the table. A restaurant worker has to take that drink to the table. We made some very minor tweaks to that. largely to deal with the hospitality industry. So looking at resort settings where individuals may be at a resort and it's kind of commonplace to be moving around with those drinks, either in and out of the hotel or in and out of different settings in the hotel.
But at a restaurant slash bar, say in downtown Salt Lake City, you're still going to be
at a restaurant downtown. You'll still have the portability issues that we've had in the state forever.
You represent the Salt Lake Restaurant Association.
Correct.
A couple of big issues came up for them during this bill as well. One would be banquets, and the second would be the return of the Zion Curtain. Talk us through that.
So there are obviously restaurants that want to do banquets. Those are technically under Utah law 2 different licenses, and there was a prohibition on having what's called a dual license, where you had a restaurant license but could then also seek a banquet license. What the legislation allowed this year is for a restaurant to go seek a banquet license that would be in addition to their restaurant license. Again, there are different rules that go with those 2 license types. So to address those different rules, what the legislature did was put in a provision that essentially, it's been called the Zion Curtain or the Zion Wall. It essentially is trying to figure out a way in which you can break up the restaurant so that if a banquet is happening at the same time someone is in there using the restaurant for its traditional purposes, those 2 events have to be separated. And the way that we did that is they have to erect a wall essentially between the banquet area and the traditional restaurant area within the establishment.
And then the mixing would happen behind that wall where the restaurant wouldn't see that going on. Talk about some of the challenges that you're seeing organizations you represent and maybe even others you've heard from are facing in these new changes.
I don't think they're necessarily facing huge changes. Obviously, if someone wants to seek this dual license, they're going to have to conform with the law that was just recently passed. I think logistically there may be some issues that we're going to have to tweak. And at the outset of the program, you asked why there's always a bill every year that kind of addresses this. I think as we roll things out, we then see what works and what doesn't work and try and come back and tweak on those. There were some restaurateurs that were concerned that erecting a wall and kind of breaking up the traditional restaurant isn't going to be all that workable because you have infrequent banquets, but the restaurant's operating all the time and you have this permanent structure in the restaurant. So the question will be, will people actually apply for these new license types that the legislature made available? And we'll see how that plays out, and then based on that, likely be back next year.
So during the process, when we were talking about the banquets and the Zion Curtain, what were some of the concerns like the Salt Lake Restaurant Association had, and what were they hoping to potentially get out of the bill?
I think the biggest issue is just logistics. How can you be serving a restaurant and serving a banquet that may be happening at the same time when you have this wall that's separating the 2 events in a common kitchen? That was the biggest issue. Again, we'll see how that plays out. We expressed that concern to the legislature, but as I mentioned, a lot of stakeholders involved. And I think the concern on the other side, which we respect and understand, is they do not want a bar environment to exist within a restaurant. I think that's kind of the big issue that everyone's trying to balance of how can you have a restaurant environment where families, kids, and others feel comfortable and not have it look and feel and act like a bar.
Right. Okay, so you've already mentioned you're pretty much already working on the next bill for next year. Anything that we need to be aware of or that you think is an important point moving forward?
Most of it's honestly going to be technical issues for restaurateurs. Obviously, we're going to be very interested in what happens with the new licenses that will be coming available and making sure that we get those numbers right. In addition to that, is just some of the logistics on how we work with DABS. Some of the issues that we are having in some of the bars is just availability of some of the spirits that they want to be selling. The system that the state uses to determine what to sell within the liquor stores and to restaurateurs or licensees is based on kind of a software package that they have that determines what people like to buy. That doesn't necessarily always work, so we'll be working on some of those tweaks as well.
Okay, we'll be watching, and I'll probably have you on again next year to talk about the next 3,000 lines of alcohol on Utah. Appreciate your insight.
Absolutely, thanks Glenn, appreciate it.
Still to come, protesters rallying on Utah.